when I started my research on badgers, I guess 10 or 11 years ago, a lot of times when I told people about it, I would get this kind of blank look or a pause while people tried to call up what they knew about badgers or what they even looked like, because they just were not on anybody's mind. And so I think that's changed. I mean, since then there's been the Randall's commentary on honey badgers. So that's gotten some good airtime and recognition for badgers as a group. And so now I have to spend my time explaining that I don't study honey badgers. I study American badgers. But nevertheless, so the work that I'm going to describe here today, I did while I was a doctoral student at UC Davis. So that was about 7 years ago. And currently I work at Great Ecology, as Margaret said, and lecture, that's where I'll be. So as an overview of what I'm going to talk about today, I'm really going to start from a very high, like 30,000-foot level, and just talk about badgers in their global context. So badgers across the world. That's something that we don't often know about or think about. There's a few badger families, or at least mustelids that are called badgers, but altogether they're an interesting group. So I'll touch on that briefly. And then I'll talk specifically about the natural history of American badgers. And that's kind of broad and general, but I find that whenever I do talk about their natural history, people always express some sort of surprise at some element of their behavior or life history. I assume that not much is known and that something can be gained from that. Then I'll talk more specifically about the American badger in California, and that's going to focus primarily on the research I did back in 2003 to 2007. And so I looked at population distribution across the state and their spatial behavior, so how they moved through the landscape and what type of habitats they used. I also evaluated potential threats to population persistence, and all of these things in the context of management and their conservation status. So when I started my research, I was really going on a lot of anecdote about badgers. People would always have a story about some badger they heard or someone they knew who saw a badger or got chased by a badger, and their reputation just really precedes them, and that can have both positive and negative consequences. Their population decline is due to not just trapping for their pelts, but also for as a nuisance species. But there's also the positive aspect of that, is that they are very interesting, and because people don't know much about them, I've found that it's a very engaging species to talk about. So I have this quote here from The Wind in the Willows. Badgers, this is about a European badger. They're a pretty highly revered species in Europe, but it said, "He seemed by all accounts to be such an important personage and, though rarely visible, to make his unseen influence felt by everybody about the place." And to me that seems pretty apt for badgers, because they're a little animal, but they definitely leave a big impression. So getting to the global distribution of badgers, so we've got the American badger, which we all know and love, and they live in North America, north to Canada and south. And the European badger, they range across Europe, not surprisingly. And then there's also the Asian badger, which is closely related to the European badger, and until recently were actually considered one species. There's the honey badger. They live in Africa up through India. And then we also have the hog badger. Let's get a quick look at that. They're pretty closely related to the European and the Asian badger, but they have kind of a hoggish nose. They live in Asia. There's also the stink badger. They live throughout the islands of Indonesia. And then also ferret badgers, and they also live in China. They're very weasel-like. The Asian badgers, and to some extent the European badgers, all eat primarily insects and grubs, things like that, whereas American badgers and honey badgers are more carnivorous. I'd say American badgers are the most carnivorous. Honey badgers will eat and fruits and things like that as well. So it is an interesting group. All these animals are called badgers, but they're not really that closely related. Actually, they're all in different subfamilies. Kind of interesting. This is a cladogram of Mustelidae, the mustelid family, so otters, weasels, skunks, and the like. And here you can see these branches show the degree of relatedness in that broader family. And so here we have Taxidea taxus, the American badger. They're the oldest badger group, the first two split off. And then we have Mellivora. These are the ferret badgers. Mellies and the hog badgers, they're another family. I'm sorry, Mellivora is actually the honey badger. And then going up here, you have the ferret badgers, which are actually going to probably be reclassified into a group, the same group of skunks. So they're really species that are related just by people seeing them and knowing that they're mustelids and that they kind of look like and act like a badger from wherever they're from. And actually the name, even the name Taxidea taxus, is a combination of both Latin and Greek words that mean generally looks like a badger. And that's probably because of so Taxidea taxus ranges across North America, as I said, in a little bit of Central America, although that's not represented on this map because their distribution is. But there are 4 recognized subspecies, and these subspecies are identified by their skull morphology. So it's not necessarily a genetic differentiation between the subspecies, and where their ranges overlap, there can be interbreeding or intermediate types. But generally, there's Jacksonii up in Michigan and Wisconsin and Minnesota, and then taxus goes across the Great Plains, and then we have in California we have 2 subspecies. There's Jeffersonii that goes down the coast, and Berlandieri, which are in the Sierra Nevada in the desert. And again, these are morphological differences in the zones between these 2 subspecies. There is types and overlap. So they mostly use grasslands and other open habitat types with friable, diggable soils where there are lots of small burrowing mammals. That's their primary food source. They're semi-fossorial, so they spend most of their time underground, both when they're hunting and when they're resting. And that's, if you have never seen a badger, that's why. They're primarily carnivorous, as I mentioned before, and almost entirely solitary outside of the breeding season. And this differs from some of the other badgers, in particular the European badger, which are, in some parts of their range, social and live in social groups, inhabiting a set of dens for generations and generations. So. And a few life history notes. The females weigh about 7 kilograms, and the males can weigh up to 15 kilograms or 30 pounds. And there's a pretty stark sexual dimorphism. So the male. The badgers I've seen in California are not 30-pound badgers, but up at the northern parts of their range, they tend to be. The females have 1 to 4 kits per year, and they're polygamous, so the males mate with many females throughout the breeding season. And they have a physiological characteristic called delayed implantation. That's an adaptation for cold weather species. So the males and females actually mate in the late summer and early fall, and then the fertilized egg does not implant in the uterine wall of the female until December or February. So that kind of delayed implantation is to make sure that the young are born during the most productive time of the year, so that there will be abundant prey. Wild, they live around 10 years. I've heard of wild badgers living up to 14 years, and in captivity they can live much longer. In their community, they have very few predators once they're adults. Young badgers can be taken by owls and hawks and coyotes, but adult badgers, by the time they're full grown, have very few species that have the inclination to deal with them. They have a lot of physical defenses against predation. One of the most striking ones being besides their aggression, is their loose skin. They have a very tough and loose hide, and if you try to grab them by it, you can almost get a whole handful, and there's still more. And they have an interesting way of being able to kind of roll inside their skin and evade predation. So even the larger predators usually don't go after badgers, although they can be taken by coyotes hunting in groups. There's a lot of anecdote and a little bit of data on their cooperative hunting behavior with coyotes in particular. For a long time, people would observe badgers and coyotes apparently hunting together, usually the coyote kind of following the badger around, and then both of them catching burrowing animals as they emerged from underground. It wasn't known if this was truly cooperative behavior, although they didn't seem to mind being near each other. But in the 90s, Steve Minta did a study up, and he actually documented how successful both the badgers were and the coyotes were at catching prey. Up there, the badgers were fairly diurnal, so he could observe them in the daytime. And he found that when the two species were hunting together, they were more successful than when they were hunting separately. So that was some actual data that sort of supported that it's kind of cooperative hunting. But a lot of other animal species will follow badgers around. When they dig for their prey, you can see ground squirrels popping up all over the place. And so raptors and other predators can capitalize on that and catch the escaping prey. They also have a significant actual physical effect on the ecosystem that they live in. They turn over amazing volumes of dirt. They dig time, and their burrows, as a lot of us probably know, are used by a lot of other species like snakes, even tiger salamanders, and burrowing owls. And one badger can dig between 1,100 and annually, and that's really a huge volume of soil, and it's a significant landscape feature where badgers are present or where they're common. There have been studies done on some of the excavations from badgers, and where they found that the tailings from a badger dig can comprise up to 5 to 8% of the landscape. So that has an enormous impact on soil processes and vegetation on the ecosystem. They move a lot. It can be very variable. So in some places, they have home ranges that are just a couple of square kilometers, but in others, they have home ranges of greater than 500 square kilometers. especially in the northern part of their range. And for a small 15 to 30 pound animal, that's a considerable home range size. But even the ones with very small home ranges disperse. They could have huge dispersals. One that had spent a whole winter in a small field and then dispersed 100 kilometers in a matter of days. So even though they have pretty short legs, they can really move when they have a mind to. And the movement data, there's studies from several states, and across these states they really vary widely. They can move up to 20 kilometers in a single night. They're mostly nocturnal, so that's when they're really on the go. And they also use new dens nightly. So when I was talking about their digging, that's because partly they're hunting, so they dig for their prey, and also they den in a site where they've been hunting prey. So they'll dig a deeper hole wherever they were hunting when they're tired, and then they'll sleep in there. And then the next night they'll move on. They often will use dens that they've dug previously or that other badgers have dug previously, but for the most a couple of factors influence their movement. Season is one, and as we see in many carnivore species that are polygamous, the males are larger than the females because enclose the home ranges, or include the home ranges of several females. And so they'll expand that range in the breeding season when they're looking for mates. Females have smaller home ranges, and they have a very loose territorial system. The females are fairly territorial and have discrete home ranges, whereas the males will overlap with both females and other males. Again, from Steve Minta's work in Wyoming, he suspected that the males were actually tracking each other to locate mates. And so males have a very loose, if almost non-existent territorial structure. The distribution of their prey also affects their home range size. If it's patchier, the home ranges will be larger. Badgers that feed primarily on ground squirrels or prairie dog colonies, several of those colonies, whereas a more evenly distributed prey base like gophers, they'll have a smaller home range. A couple of conservation notes on badgers. In many places, they're a fur-bearing species, so they can be trapped with a permit, including here in California. Have a trapping season that's year-round except for between November and taken in any number. There's no bag limit. And they are also considered, they're probably taken more as a nuisance species for depredation rather than for recreation or profit. So you can take any amount for depredation without a permit, and you can see here this is a picture of some of their digs. That can be a nuisance for farmers, especially in irrigated agriculture, and ranchers who worry about their cows falling in the holes and breaking legs. Cemeteries, and that's problems that are obvious. So they're often, when they're trapped, they're destroyed rather than re-released elsewhere. Historically, their fur was used fairly widely in hats and the trim on coats and for shaving brushes, and shaving brushes even up until fairly recently. But that is probably less so now. Their pelt price is pretty low, but it has had some peaks in the past. Some other characteristics of badgers that are important in a conservation context is that they have a very low reproductive rate. Any given year, only about a quarter of the females will produce. They don't typically breed in their first year, and second year. The juveniles have a very high rate of mortality, sometimes only 50 surviving their first year. They're fairly around, and again, that's because they live in really open habitat types and don't really have the defense to protect themselves until they're adults. They're wide-ranging, as I mentioned before, and this makes them pretty sensitive to the effects of habitat fragmentation because they're often coming in contact with the edges of protected areas and with roads and urban areas. And so because they're physically limited in their movement capacity, they can't jump, they have very short legs, they're not particularly fast, they can't climb over highway medians, run into a lot of problems, especially collisions with cars on the roads. So all these factors point to their vulnerability as a species, especially in small populations that are becoming increasingly isolated from each other. There's been a couple of studies looking at the effects of habitat fragmentation on badgers, and this one was from Southern California. That at habitat fragments throughout Southern California and the size of the carnivores that inhabited them. And generally, he found a linear relationship in the size of the animal and the size of the patch that it inhabited, except for a few species. Interestingly enough, they're all mustelids, but they were found only in habitat patches that were much larger than would be expected based on their body size. Carnivores here in California, whereas badgers and spotted skunks and the long-tailed weasel are. There was another simulation model done in by the Nature Conservancy in Oklahoma, and in this study they were looking at badger population persistence, brine spills from the petroleum extraction industry up there, and looking at that as a source of habitat fragmentation. And they found as the habitat was increasingly fragmented that the populations declined, and that the fragmentation specifically affected their population sizes. They went low levels. It affected population persistence, so the location of small populations, and particularly the fragmentation reduced the abilities of females to find mates because of traveling between habitat fragments led to high probability of mortality. So another important factor in that model driving the population decline was the ability of the males to maintain high-quality habitats when their habitat was fragmented. The fragmentation exposed them to risks in the matrix between habitats. Younger males were not able to secure high-quality habitat patches because they were already occupied by adults. Will fight and drive off incoming younger males. So for these reasons, and even though those data are fairly spotty, that's enough to warrant a bit of conservation concern. So several states, badgers are listed as species of special concern. And in the U.S., there's not a higher listing than special concern ordinarily, just because there's never enough data to conclusively say that they're threatened with extinction. But in Canada, in British Columbia in particular, the range, they're listed as critically endangered. And in British Columbia, they suspect there's only a few hundred left up there, so they are engaging in really active conservation there. So I'm going to talk more specifically about badgers in California. They have an interesting history here. Most of what we know about badgers from early settlement days came from Joseph Grinnell and Joseph Dixon and Gene Linsdale in their 2 volumes, Set Mammals of the World, or Mammals of California. And in that time, Joseph Grinnell collected trapping records from across the state to look at the distribution of badgers, and he suspected there had been a huge decline of populations, probably 80 to 90% trapping in the early 1900s. But generally, back then they inhabited the open habitats I described before. So the coastal foothills around the Central Valley, in the Central Valley, and high mountain meadows, and also the deserts in the northeast part of the state, where they were seemed to be evenly distributed across the state. So this kind of starts to get into my research that I did. My research was part of a CDFW, actually, UC Davis Resource Assessment Program. So it was a collaboration between Cal Fish and Wildlife and the UC Davis Wildlife. And they funded my research for 3 years, and the goal was to evaluate the conservation status of badgers. So here they're listed as a species of special concern. That listing hadn't been reviewed since its first designation in 1986. So generally, I was just looking to get an idea of what the current population distribution was and learn a little bit about their behavioral ecology and how they moved through and used habitat types. Because that hadn't been studied here in California, and the listing for as a special status or a species of special concern, one of the items that they recommended was to learn more and acknowledge that there was a general lack of data to make any other kind of assessment. So the product of this research was to be a species status report that was based on literature review and actual data. This is the first map that I went off of that indicated that badger population distribution much everywhere. And this map it's good actually. It explains a lot, even though it doesn't really seem to. But it's there's an interesting phenomenon in badgers where I would go to places where they were quite common and no one ever saw them, or I would go to places where people said, oh, of course they're common. They're all over the place here, and couldn't find one. So they have both the ability to show up in very odd places or to be in places where we expect them and no one ever sees them. So my first goal was to get a little bit more resolution than this and to see where they actually still were compared to what Grinnell documented back in the early 1900s to the 1930s. So as I mentioned, there was thought to be some significant population declines with European settlement due to high numbers of trapping. So they became pretty rare across their range between the 40s and the 80s. So this map here is showing records that, the trapping records that Grinnell mapped from California and across the world. There are California badgers in museums all across the country and some even in Europe. And these are all the locations from that are pre-1965, and I kind of consider those historical, the historical distribution because it was before the population expansion in California. So because of the intense trapping and the perceived reduction in their numbers, they were listed as a fur bearer with a season. then, there have been some heightened restrictions because trapping take was still fairly high in the 70s and 80s. CDFW did an assessment in 1985, and this led to their listing as a species of special concern. But they recognized that there didn't seem to be as many badgers in the Central Valley on the North Coast, and that the population seemed to have become more separated from each other rather than widely distributed across the state. You can kind of this map also includes sightings that I collected from people, agencies that had lists of species sightings from the CNDDB, from other surveys of land managers and people who this represents about 570 sightings in modern times. And then some other data that I looked at just to get an idea of what might be going on with the population at a large scale. I looked at trapping records from Cal Fish and Wildlife and also Wildlife Services, and starting in 1986. And you can see that back in the mid-'80s, they were still being trapped at pretty high numbers, so a couple hundred. And most of these were from, interestingly, San Bernardino County and from Modoc County. And then that kind of dropped pretty quickly into the early 90s. And I put also the black line here as the number of permits sold, so I think that probably had something to do with that trapping numbers of badgers trapped. And then for predator control from Wildlife Services, I had data starting in the mid-90s, and that oscillated a little bit but did decline in the early 2000s, but has for the most part stayed at a fairly constant level until fairly recently, where it's dropped quite a bit. This data isn't very telling of what the actual population is doing, but it was just something to look at and see if there was anything that might show any kind of population patterns in population size. And actually, these trapping data, they probably show far fewer animals than are actually being taken because so many are taken by depredation. There was a Fish and Wildlife report that I came across that surveyed hunters in Siskiyou. It reported that 34 trappers and hunters had taken 160 badgers in 1 year out of 60. I mean, I guess who knows in general. Another thing that I looked at were activity indices as a potential surrogate for population size, and it's a dubious indicator. The frequency of digging can be related to the type of prey they're going after, or how easy it is to catch the prey, or what the soil is like, and not necessarily an indicator of how many start. So I looked at 17 sites across California, and I focused specifically on the Central Coast, and that was the focus of the Resource Assessment Program at the time. So I looked at sites that were both in contiguous habitats, so large state parks or protected areas, and I also looked at sites that were within a matrix of agricultural development. And basically walking kilometer-long transects, I counted how many digs or signs of badgers I saw, both dens and hunting holes. And so in this graph, you can see on the left side of the graph, these are all the sites that were on the central coast. And the highest amounts of activity were in these large protected areas, so the Carrizo Plain, Camp Roberts, in the central, well, but the inland grassland, oak woodland habitat. And then Fort Ord, which is just east of, a lot more about that site in a minute, but really there was only a lot of activity in the very large protected areas. The rest of these areas, it was low to non-existent, and in the Sierra Nevada foothills, there was hardly any activity at all. Part of that is because the population density is probably less. I think that their prey there is a lot patchier than it would be in the coastal areas where they can prey on gophers that are pretty evenly distributed. Ground squirrels in the probably likely that you'd have to survey a bigger area to come across the number of badgers. So again, that doesn't give the greatest idea of how many badgers there are, but it does show relative levels of activity. And the population density estimates at the time that I had read when I started this work were that there were between 96,000 and 1.2 million. Not entirely sure where they came from. They were reported by Wildlife Services. And I looked at these indices of activity and thought if I scaled those up, the highest density of activity and across the state, and assumed that there was high density of 1 or 2 badgers every couple of kilometers, my estimates were far lower than that, and that would be around 72,000 across the whole state and as few as 22,000. And that's if the entire state was comprised of optimal habitat. So obviously there's likely far fewer than that, but it's a hard number to get a handle on, at least at that scale. So the next component of my research was on habitat use, and I did a behavioral study in Monterey County on the Fort Ord public land. And Fort Ord was the center of my research site, but I also used adjacent sites, part of the UC Natural Reserve System, some private properties that were adjacent, but all in all covered about 150 kilometers square. And the reason that I chose that site is because I knew there were badgers there. That was a good start. But really the diversity of habitats, there's oak woodland, there's coastal sage chaparral, maritime chaparral with manzanita. There were extensive annual and native grasslands. And so it would be a good opportunity to look at how they were using a variety of habitat types over a fairly small area. There was also interesting activity around the edges of the site. So we have irrigated agriculture up here in the Salinas Valley in the northwest. Down here is the Santa Lucia Mountains, and they're very large contiguous blocks of habitat. And then all around here is both urban and suburban and residential development. So you have CSUMB down here, towns of Seaside and Monterey, and even some suburban housing developments right around here. And then also this highway that goes from Monterey to Salinas were other factors that I was interested to know how the badgers interacted with those in the landscape. So this is just a few pictures of the habitat types in the study site. This is on the north side of Fort Ord. And then chaparral, and there are also a few large water bodies and some pretty thick oak forests. So I was able to catch 10 badgers, 6 females and 4 males, and I caught them with a snare because you can't use leg hold traps here. So this is a wire snare that traps them around the body. You can only really, this only really works if you can put the snare in a burrow that you know a badger is in. And I mentioned before how many, so that's why I caught only 10 badgers. It was not hard to find badger burrows, but it was very hard to find burrows that were freshly dug that also contained a badger. So we would catch them in the snare. They would be attached to the ground by a length of the snare, and we checked the traps all night long. And when we found one that was caught, we'd have to dig the badger out of the hole with a catch pole, and then we implanted them with radio transmitters. They don't have necks to speak of, really, so they can't wear radio collars. And because of their pastoral habits, a harness wasn't very feasible because they could come off going. And I had talked to other researchers who said that they often inexplicably managed to get out of the harnesses. So I worked with veterinarians from the Wildlife Health Center and from the Wildlife Veterinary Care and Research Center in Santa Cruz, Dave Jessup, and with Mike Murray from the Monterey Bay Aquarium. They were experienced in doing these implanted transmitters with sea otters, so they collaborated with them on this project so that they could do the same for badgers. And that is pretty much the standard way of radio marking badgers. The same procedures have been used in Canada as well. So we used the local vet clinic or the facilities at the Marine Wildlife Veterinary Care Center to do the surgeries. And they were able to, as soon as they recovered from surgery, within a day, we could re-release them on the site of their capture, and often observed them hunting that same night. So they, in general, recovered well from the surgery. Radio locations for movement data. They were almost entirely nocturnal, so we did most of our work at night and tried to get locations on animals at least once a week. For den locations, we could find those in the day where they were denning, and we would get those locations as well at least once a week. And we also had some continuous tracking sessions where we followed one animal for several hours to get an idea of what their movement paths look like. So with the location data, I looked at their habitat preference on a couple of scales. So I looked at how they chose habitat within their home range, so one animal within compared to the composition of the home range as a whole, and that's called third habitat preference. And then I also looked at second order habitat preference, which is looking at how they site their home ranges in the larger landscape compared to the composition of the larger study area. And I looked at den and active animal locations separately to see if they were using different habitat factors I looked at as potentially affecting their habitat use for vegetation types: grasslands, oak woodlands, riparian areas and wetlands, American chaparral, and urban and agricultural areas. Sandy to loams to clays, and also the slope, so, separated into five slope classes. Here's a fairly simplified picture of the home ranges of the badgers that I tracked, and these are connecting the outermost locations of each animal's movement. So up here, these large ones, these are all males. This red one, and the ones down here are all females. So these three that are overlapping almost entirely, there was an older female who I caught with one of her kits, and later I caught another young kit that I think was probably hers. But they, for the most part, seemed to share. The kits were independent of their mother, but they seemed to share the habitat, the home range. And then there was a couple other females here, and you can see they didn't really overlap with that family. This purple one is a male that I caught, and he was interesting. Regularly crossed this highway at night, and I often found him on one side of the highway or the other. As long as I followed him, he made it, but it was very disconcerting to me. As far as their home range sizes, the results weren't a huge surprise. The females are the purplish colors, and the males are the purple colors, and they had much larger home ranges than the females. In terms of their habitat preference, so for all their locations, where they sited their home ranges in the landscape, they preferred the annual grasslands and the oak woodland scrub habitat. They avoided urban areas and the agricultural areas, and also the maritime chaparral. They did show a preference for the sandy and the loamy soils, so the very diggable soil types, and they avoided cold. And I guess that wasn't a surprise. I've often heard ecology called the painful elaboration of the obvious, and so really this just verified what I told you earlier about badgers and their habitat preferences. Interestingly, within their home ranges, they showed a different type of habitat preference. So for their active locations, they were all over the place. They didn't show any preference for slope or vegetation or any of those factors that I considered. For their den locations, they did show a preference. They scrub more than the grasslands, but they also preferred the grasslands to the other habitat types. Not prefer urban or wetland habitat types, and they also showed no preference for soil types at this scale, which I thought was interesting because I thought with their preference for the more friable soils, but they didn't. And in some areas, I did observe that they would dig up huge rocks and dig into very rocky soil, and so they don't seem very limited by soil type. They preferred the intermediate slopes. They didn't like to den on flat ground, and they didn't like to den on, probably because of just the energetics of digging, also flood risk. So that was a little different, and it aligned in some respects with research elsewhere, although there have been other studies that strong preference for the more loamy soils. That could be because their resources are much more limited there, so expected that they'd be more selective of optimal habitat type. Then I also looked at their movement paths. This is just an illustration of a movement path of a young female across the night. So we would take fixes or locations of the animals every 15 minutes, connect those together. So in looking at the movement path, specifically I was looking at path complexity and their travel speed. And the reason for this is that those two factors often are indicative of habitat selection. So animals tend to move in a more complex path when they're in preferred habitat, and they also move slower through that. So I was using these as an indicator of what types of habitat they were choosing when they were active. And so I also looked at those two measures of movement by different vegetation types, by sex, and by season. This shows the different travel speeds for the males and the females between seasons, and there really wasn't any difference between the males and the females, but both males and females moved significantly more during the mating season and during the spring than they did in the fall. And they were generally not very active in the fall. Sometimes they'd stay in dens a couple of nights. And that is consistent with what has been seen in badgers in northern latitudes. I wasn't sure if we would see that same reduction in activity in coastal temperate, but it seems like their physiology is pretty much the same as in the northern latitudes. As far as the mating season travel being faster, that's not surprising when they're out looking for mates. Spring is the most productive time of the year, so it could be that the females are feeding their young, and there's a lot more prey to go find, but that result was a little bit unexpected as well. So in terms of the path complexity, it wasn't affected by sex or season or vegetation type, so it didn't seem as though those factors affected habitat preference. However, the males' travel speeds varied by the vegetation type they were in, so at least in the spring and the winter, they were selected. Different males preferred different habitat types, but nevertheless, they both showed a preference for one over the other. That was not the case in the fall, so the males were not selective at all of habitat type in the fall, and that's probably because they were driven more by finding females rather than finding food. Conversely, females' travel speeds weren't related to vegetation type any. So this is a very small sample size, but it could indicate that males are much less selective of habitat in the breeding season. That does have some important management implications. That could, well, for one thing, it's obvious that the badgers use a mosaic of habitats within their home range, not just the grasslands. They use fairly large sites. Their home ranges were a scale of tens of kilometers, and even though that's a lot smaller than the ones in Canada, it's still a fair size. So a core habitat blocks need to be on a fairly large scale for a population of badgers. Corridor habitat could potentially be more flexible. They were less selective when they were moving around. They moved most in the summer and in the spring and the summer, and so that is when they would probably be most likely to be using the habitat. And there's the potential use of suboptimal habitat, at least for the males, during the mating season. So that would be probably the time that we would expect more conflict in agricultural fields, more collisions on roads. And so those are all that are helpful to know when planning for badger conservation or planning with badgers as a focal species. Some of these data were used by Tanya Diamond at San Jose State, and she was regional connectivity throughout the Bay Area. So this actually shows the Monterey region where I had my study. So this is Fort Ord. Avalon Range over here. And as you go further north, you see that this, so this maps the yellow and green and favorable habitat types, with the red being unfavorable habitat types. And so it gives you an idea of how connected the landscape is from a badger's point of view. And as you move further and further north, you see more separation between the two ranges, and definitely more isolated populations. Back here when I mentioned that core habitat size or minimum core habitat size, it's hard to know exactly what the requirement is for a viable population without more detailed demographic data. Looking at these smaller segments and being able to follow those badgers and see what their mortality rates and how many births are happening and how many juveniles are surviving would give a better idea of if the population. And then another component of the research I did in collaboration with veterinarians from the Wildlife Health Center, and we looked at pathogen and rodenticide exposure in badgers. And we made a cover of the Journal of Wildlife Diseases, even though it was a small note of just a sample size of, I think, 14 badgers, where we looked for evidence of exposure to rodenticide and pathogens. So for disease, we were mostly interested in disease in the context of badgers being at the urban or agricultural wildlife interface. So this is just a look at some of what that interface looked like in different parts of the state. Down near Bakersfield, this badgers, at least badger activity in this grassland preserve here, but it's entirely surrounded by irrigated agriculture. Not too far to the east, there are large open grassy hills. So lots of different types of fragmentation we saw. This is in San Luis Obispo, the city of San Luis Obispo. There's badgers here, quite a lot of activity here, some activity down here. There's a lot of smaller regional parks that look like they could be good badger habitat, but there are not badgers there. Here we're seeing more of a fragmentation by, it's a small town, but by urban development. Here we would expect more interaction with domestic animals. Out here, this is in near Visalia, so this grassland patch has a lot of badger activity, and again we see irrigated agriculture and orchards. Actions that they're having in the fragmented habitat here. And I also showed you for Ord that has a lot of different types of matrices. So we were focusing on diseases that would result from exposure to domestic animals, so cats and dogs, to peri-urban species like raccoons. Also diseases that posed a risk to livestock and public health. We also looked at diseases that could pose a risk to or to other wildlife species, or that other wildlife species carried that could be a risk to badgers. Temper, plague, toxoplasma gondii, paratuberculosis. We looked at parvovirus, Lyme disease, and anaplasma, and tularemia. Most of these diseases we focused on because of either their known occurrence in badgers, either American badgers or badgers elsewhere, or because of their occurrence in sensitive species or livestock species. Cows, really. We also, because we were doing these necropsies, we took the opportunity to look for evidence of exposure to anticoagulant rodenticides. And that, so we looked at both first and second generation anticoagulants, difascinone, and then the second generation brodifacoum, bromadiolone. And we were able to look at the secondary poisoning. We could look at the sera of the live badgers that we were trapping, but for the other, we also had road-killed badgers that we looked at, and we were able to look at the tissues for that. Obviously, there was a fortunately, a solid precedent for expecting that they would be exposed to these types of. We actually thought that probably the badgers had a higher likelihood of exposure than a lot of these other wildlife species, because even with the first, well, particularly with the first generation anticoagulants, they don't persist in the tissues as long, and they take multiple feedings for the animal to die, whereas the second generation ones, they're much more toxic. They can be fatal with one feeding, and they persist in the tissue. So, but for badgers, or for animals that are poisoned, they often retreat to their burrows when they're not feeling well, and at least for the first generation anticoagulants, that's the point, is that they'll go below ground. They'll have time to go below ground and die below ground, so reducing the exposure, scavenge the carcass. But that doesn't really work for badgers because they hunt underground, so they have a much higher likelihood of exposure than, say, a raptor or other species that would be mostly foraging above ground. So anyway, given the risks, we were pretty interested in what we would see with our animals. And I won't go into this into too much detail, but recently the Department of Pesticide Regulation has looked at these anticoagulants more in depth and evaluated their risks, and as a result of that, have together with the EPA, have heightened restrictions on the use of especially the second generation anticoagulants. So we had our captured badgers from the Fort Ord site, and then road-killed badgers that we obtained from Northern California and from LA. And so for the live badgers, we were able to do serologic tests, and for the dead badgers, we could use the tissue sample. So here are the results of the disease surveillance. So for the road-killed badgers, their carcasses usually were not fresh enough to look at sera and detect antibody testing for. But for the badgers at Fort Ord, we found a number of incidents of exposure to common diseases of domestic animals, so canine distemper, toxoplasmosis, Bartonella, and tularemia, anaplasma. And we didn't see any clinical sign of disease in any of these animals. The antibodies just indicate that they've been exposed to them. So we found those, and then weren't able to, as I mentioned, to test the road-killed badgers. For the second generation anticoagulants, we did find trace amounts in the road-killed badgers, both from California and from Southern California. So that was kind of interesting that we were seeing rural badgers up north with exposure to anticoagulants that are supposed to be used only in a commensal, not necessarily out in the field. So they were still being exposed, and as well as a badger in LA County. And that's consistent with what they've been finding in the carnivores in the Santa Monica Mountains, the bats and the mountain lions, and the didn't detect any rodenticides in the badgers that we trapped at Fort Ord. Again, we could only test their sera, not their tissues. So the results of that study, as I showed you, they were published in the Journal of Wildlife Diseases, and the DPR included that study in their review of the risks of coagulants to wildlife. And as I mentioned, we saw the patterns of both in an urban and a rural context. And but really to get an idea of the extent and the impact of this exposure, there would need to be continued surveillance over time. We had a fairly few animals that we were looking at. So kind of wrapping up here, what came out of all this and what would the next steps be. I would say for the consideration of the conservation status, we would need a lot more actionable data to go from to determine that that badger populations are actually declining or at risk of, at least in terms of local extirpation. So really what's needed is just some sort of monitoring of badgers. We're starting from a place where we don't even know if they're present or absent, let alone how many they are and if their population is persisting over time. We know very little about the population structure, how many badgers there are in a group of badgers, or at least in an interval, about whether they're able to cross from one side of the Central Valley to the other, where the genetic exchange is happening and where it isn't happening. And a lot about their demographics either, like how often they're reproducing and how successful. Also, beyond the trapping data, there's not much known about how much mortality they're facing. They're often seen on the side of roads as roadkill because they cannot work across those medians, or run very fast, or run away. They don't tend to be the type of animal that. So a lot of times they'll just stand in the road. So that's probably a pretty significant driver of any population declines that may be happening. And we got so we've identified a couple of the risks. There could be the disease risk. We did show that they're being exposed to a variety of pathogens. We don't really know what the effect of those pathogens are at higher rates of exposure, or if they're, if they're signs, but it's something that could be watched to get a better idea of what the risk, how prevalent that risk is, especially as badger populations are increasingly coming into contact with urban areas and agricultural areas. And so a lot of that research was quite some time ago, but I've still tried to stay involved where I can. In 2012, I attended the first International Badger Symposium, and only International Badger Symposium. And so in this picture, that's everybody that was there. So these are people from all over the world who study badgers, and we all got together in Canada and talked about badgers. There was a couple of Americans. There's myself and Ron Rempel, who was working down in Southern California, was there, but a lot of Canadians and people from France, from South Africa, from Portugal. It was a really great opportunity to learn about what everybody else was doing and what other badger populations elsewhere were facing. The outcome of this symposium is the book that Margaret mentioned, Badgers of the World, and I wrote a chapter on pathogens and parasites in badgers for that book. And I also worked on a paper with Maria Santos. She went to UC Davis as well, and she did a comparative study using my data, looking at the breeding timing of badgers in Mediterranean climates and comparing American badgers to European at their habitat use, and kind of extrapolating these results to implications for climate change. publications in preparation for you. I also wrote a species status report for Cal Fish and Wildlife, and that in 2009. I assume it's in review. Probably any day now will be published and available to everybody. And so with that, I just want to acknowledge the funding I had for these projects. Again, the Resource Assessment Program, American Museum of Natural History. That collaborated with me, and people that let me on their land and let me store badger carcasses in their freezers, and all I have. So if you have any questions, I welcome them.
Okay, so I'm going to come around with the microphone if you have a question, and this is so that the people listening online can hear your question as well. And if you are listening online, you can type your question in and we will get it to Jessie. Okay, so does anybody have a question?
Hi, Jessie. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm just curious, in regards to their polygamy, are they both polygamous? Do you happen to know if females will mate with more than one male as well?
The breeding season?
Yeah.
It's mostly the males that are polygamous, although it has been seen in European badgers where both the females are searching for mates as well as the males, and so that it's a little bit different social structure. But as far as I know, in American badgers, it's the males primarily.
Hi, I'm a little curious. What actually defines a depredation issue? I mean, my understanding of depredation is when a predator takes some animal. And so how does the Department of Fish and Wildlife Service define depredation with regards to badgers?
I don't know that it's defined at all. I think it's more property damage would be considered depredation. You don't need a permit to take a badger for depredation. So I think that if they are digging in your yard, or obviously if they're going after maybe chickens or pets or perceived as a threat to those, that would be considered depredation, and that's when they're taken as a nuisance species. But it doesn't have a formal definition, as far as I know, in the Fish and Game Code. So I think property damage would be the driver for that kind of take.
Interesting.
It is interesting.
That's a little different than a lot of other carnivores. So there actually has to be a depredation event when it's associated with coyote or mountain lion or bobcat. So it's, property damage, turning up the landscape is kind of a bit of a concern.
Yeah.
I know that elk, when they tear up fencing or consume alfalfa, are considered depredating. Find as.
And it's also, as I mentioned in the beginning, I think a lot of it is just the perception as a nuisance species, that when you see one, you shoot it. So I've definitely seen that in other states too.
Thanks, Jessie. It's great to finally see your PhD blog. I missed it. I was gone. I want to let you know, I don't know if I told you by email, but we have confirmed CDV cases in badgers in California, and I'm happy to share that with you.
Yeah, that would be great.
And sorry, canine distemper virus. So the case that I know of offhand was a badger in Sonoma County. But I can give you that information.
Yeah, that's great to know.
And then just so people don't think hope is not lost, the department is actively monitoring for rodenticide and toxin exposures in badgers and mesocarnivores. So that's what the Wildlife Investigations Lab. Stella McMillan is our toxicologist, and I'm there as the non-game species vet. So we are we're building on the 14 that Jessie's hard work started, and we're actively monitoring across the state, especially with the change in the regulations. We want to see if that's reflected in the field. So badgers are a species of interest for that. But thank you. It was awesome. Jessie is the foundation of this work. She worked so hard to get those 10 badgers. I can't even tell you.
Thank you, Deanna. And I feel, too, that in monitoring for the anticoagulants, you run into the same problem that you do with the, with the target rodents dying underground, that the badgers could be dying underground, too. I mean, that's where they're going to go when they're not feeling well. So it's a challenge.
Makes them valuable.
Yeah, definitely.
Hi, Jessie. You said that this is a species that does not really run away or stand on from anything. We deal with a lot of things that are not necessarily fragmenting habitat, but we might have disturbance due to construction activities. Do you see that having any issue? I mean, these species have any avoiding areas because of activity?
I do think they avoid areas that are very disturbed. Sometimes, because sometimes disturbance will drum up small mammals and they'll be running everywhere. So at Fort Ord, we actually had a wildfire, and where the wildfire went through, there were all these badger holes there, and I'm sure they were just picking off the rodents that had been displaced from their burrows. And a lot of times you'll see them on roadsides and other places or levees where there's gophers and other rodents that like disturbed habitat. But I think as far as badgers are very sensitive to sound and smell, and so if there's a large scale development or disturbance, they'll probably leave. I think. So yeah, I know that also on Fort Ord they would use sheep for weed control, and usually wherever the sheep were, the badgers were not, even if they had been there just previously. So, yeah.
Hi, I work in the Sacramento area in a wildlife area, and I see some badgers in the Davis area. Yeah. How are the badgers doing in the Davis area, and what is the determination of their distribution? I mean, I see them as far as east as West Sacramento, and right now we got some in Hermosillo that are doing some damage. So how are they doing right here locally?
Well, that's really interesting. I don't know of many that come, that close to, down in the valley. I knew of some records, roadkill, as it usually is, from the mid-90s out by Davis, west of Davis. West of Davis and into the Coast Range, they seem to be doing all right. I mean, they're definitely there and seem to be doing fine. But here on the valley floor, they hardly ever have I seen any reports or heard any reports. So yours is interesting. I have seen them out at Mather Regional Park. I've seen burrow activity, and I have seen dead ones up in the El Dorado Hills. Ones is an exaggeration. I've seen one along Highway 50 up in the El Dorado Hills area, but in general, pretty rare, the sightings here. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Yeah, I wouldn't put it past them. I mean, I explained the large distances that they disperse, and they probably use the same dispersal corridors that like a coyote or the mountain lions that turn up in town use, coming down the river corridors. I can't see a badger coming into town and setting up its home range there, but definitely passing through. They can pop up almost anywhere, especially the young dispersing juveniles that need to find a new territory. Well, territory, they're not really territorial, but a new area where they're not in competition with the older badgers that might try to drive them away. That's really interesting. I had wondered if they ever turned up in the valley and just hadn't seen that happen. All right. Convenient.
So Jessie, we have some questions for you from the online audience, so I'm going to read those for you.
Okay.
Okay. The first one is, do badgers swim, and are rivers barriers?
Badgers do swim, actually. I've seen pictures and heard people who've seen badgers swimming. They're fairly adept swimmers. I have long wondered if rivers would serve as a barrier. Unless rivers, I guess, and more like the California aqueduct, I wonder if they can cross that. I know there's bridges in certain spots, but with those smooth, hard-banked sides, I wonder how they do. And I really don't know, but yeah, they do swim.
Okay, here's another one. I'm currently working on a monitoring protocol for badgers using camera traps and perhaps scent dogs. Do you think it would be useful to have a standardized monitoring protocol for badgers in California?
Yeah, that would be great. But I sometimes wonder about using the methods that we typically use for carnivores. I didn't have the best luck. I did actually another study that I didn't have time to talk about where I compared different monitoring methods. And I compared camera stations and track plates, not plates, but tracking areas, and spotlight surveys, and the walking transects that I did early in my research. And really, I couldn't attract those guys in with anything. Like I tried rancid meat, I tried the canine call, so I had no way to get them to come to a camera station. They didn't seem to travel along trails the way that the coyotes did on site, or even the skunks. They just sort of went willy-nilly across the landscape. So, setting up stations along trails was not helpful. Spotlighting, they're hard to see, they're too low to the ground. And the only thing that was a really robust detector of badgers was the transect walking, because it's so easy to find their sign. It's labor intensive, but besides the cost of the labor, it's cheap, pretty lo-fi. You just walk up and down. But I think that would probably be the best monitoring protocol. I think they are likely to be missed with other standard monitoring techniques. In my experience, maybe somebody has a better thing to try than I did.
I'm going to read you one more question, and then I'll come back to the audience. Does wildfire of timberlands and shrublands create usable denning and hunting habitat for badgers? If so, for how long?
I don't know. I mean, I did talk about that one incident at Fort Ord, where following I guess it was a manzanita forest fire, the badgers just descended on that area, and because of the abundant prey and plenty of area to dig. But in a forest, I don't know. I know that in some parts of their range in North America, they've actually expanded to the east, where forests have been cleared. So it could stand to reason that they do well in the post-wildfire environment, but I don't have any data to support that.
I was wondering if badgers use latrines like some other carnivores where you could pick up scats.
Yeah, they do use latrines. Fortunately, they're usually underground. So, and that's another hard part. Another hard thing about badgers is that and a lot of mustellas, they'll bury their scat, and so it's hard to find without a detector dog. also their scats look an awful lot like coyote scat, and it's really hard to distinguish between the two. I had a very, very experienced tracker working with me, and even he wasn't sure all of the time. So, yeah. A lot of the same things as here. They think historic trapping pressures caused the early declines, and they have a lot of badgers that are getting hit by cars on the roads up there. I wouldn't say that it's more than here, but in their studies, they'd have, they'd lose half the study population in vehicle collisions. So that could be an artifact of them moving such long distances that they're going to be coming into a lot more conflict with humans than at least the badgers that I studied that were staying in that, for the most part, staying in that small area and not venturing into the agriculture or the suburban or even crossing that road, except for the one guy who crossed the road all the time. The rest of them just weren't coming in contact with risks like a badger that was moving a lot further would. They also use, well, I don't know about British Columbia, but I know in other parts of Canada until fairly recently, they were using much more toxic rodenticides than we use in the U.S. They're still using like strychnine and things like that.
I have a follow-up question about the scat. Did you collect badger scat for diet analysis?
No, I didn't. I had my hands full with what I was doing already, but it would have been interesting. There's a lot of information of scat analysis, badger scat analysis, and the range of types of foods they eat.
And we have a badger sighting being reported. I saw a badger on the side of Highway 89 last evening, approximately 1.6 miles of McLeod at about 6:20 p.m.
Well, that's great. Where's McLeod? Is that? Oh, by Shasta. Oh. Yeah, they seem to be pretty numerous up north, especially Lassen County. They seem to be really common up there.
Thanks for coming out. My name is Brian. I'm the zoology lead for the California Natural Diversity Database. If you do have detections of badgers, you should submit them to the database so that other folks will know where things have been detected at. So we do have a new online field survey form which goes right into a spatial database and will likely pop up much quicker within a couple months of being submitted, so people could know where badgers are being seen. Thanks.
All right.
CNDDB. Absolutely. We'll take any detection of badger.
Right, right. Yeah, I think that came around after my study was done, but I think that would be a really great way to get an idea. Well, I mean, not the roadkill part, but yeah, Frater's.
Second one too, so there's a bit of a conflict there.
Oh, really? Okay. Yeah, I've seen that. Yeah, Fraser Schilling and that group had a. Yeah. Oh, okay. Be nice to get those together.
I'm just, I'm wondering what some of the distinguishing characteristics of like the burrow, what, because I walk around and I see, I'm over in Contra Costa County and they have, I got all kinds of different kinds of burrows and stuff, so.
That usually comes up.
Really?
So a badger burrow is usually shaped like a badger. It's wider than it is tall, so it's like a football. There's ordinarily a huge tailing in front of it, not all the time, but often. So you can see here this giant tailing here. And then you'll also see these shallower digs. Again, they'll be circular or oval. Those are the hunting holes. And to contrast, here's a coyote hole, and most of the canids will have those kind of elongated holes vertically. And then looking closer, you can see, and this is pretty definitive, is the claw marks along the side. If the soil's right, you can see it. Badgers sort of paddle into the ground, and they have really long claws. And so you can see the claw marks extending like along the sides of the burrow entrance, whereas canids will go down vertically. So.
Hey Jessie, does anybody know about their vision? How cute is their vision? Do they have a lot more rods and cones? Are they able to, I mean, they have really, really small eyes.
Well, they're rods and cones. But I could tell you that I don't think that, they do not see very well at all. It was really confusing for me when I first trapped the badgers because they sort of move and act like they're blind. For the way they tilt their heads, they don't look at things, you know. So their vision is poor, but they're mostly nocturnal, so you know, their sense of smell and their hearing is very acute, and that's how they navigate and how they locate prey primarily. So.
But when they do this cooperative hunting with the coyotes, I've watched them do that, and they're on the prey item pretty quickly. It's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, and it's really their nose. They follow their nose. Seeing them hunting before, it's like their nose is to the ground. Well, they're all to the ground, but their nose, you know, they're following their nose. When I caught them, we would first transfer them into a canvas bag, just sort of settle them down before we put them in, like in their container before surgery, and they would. Like you could see in the canvas bag their nose like moving around at the edge of the bag, like looking for my hand to bite me. So whereas if I actually looked at them, they didn't look directly at me. It was like they were always looking off to the side, and their nose was moving all over the place. So the first badger I caught, I thought there was something wrong with its vision because it looked so blind. But and I probably should have known already that they didn't have very good sight. So. Also on that note, they have also been seen hunting above ground, but what they're doing is they're listening for movement below ground, and then they'll dig down to where there's an animal in a burrow. Often young prairie dogs that haven't emerged yet, that's how they'll find them, or burrowing mammals that have gone into, you know, the early stages of hibernation or torpor. They'll dig those out by listening.
Okay, I have another online question for you. Do females release pheromones, and if so, could they be synthesized or used for monitoring attractants?
Oh, I don't know. The badgers, they do, being mustelids, they do. They have scent glands, and they don't spray, but they do kind of exude an odor when they're threatened. I don't know specifically about females if they have a pheromone that would attract badgers to a scent station or wherever you were trying to attract them to. It seems like that's a probability, especially since that's likely how the males are finding them. So that might work. Yeah, their smell is, you'll smell it when you're at a burrow that a badger is in or has recently been to. And it's, I don't know how to describe it. It's not like a skunk. It's not entirely unpleasant, but it's a little bit, I don't know, spicy smelling. I don't know. It's distinct. But yeah, that's a good idea. I don't know how you get it, or obtain it, but.
We have a follow-up question on that. Okay. Would the use of tracking dogs expose badgers to disease?
Oh, I don't think necessarily. I know, and down in San Diego County, the USGS uses tracking dogs to locate badger burrows. They're pretty hard to find down there, probably because as I mentioned before, their prey is pretty dispersed, so they probably have they're probably living at low densities and have large range sizes. But you know, I suppose that I would recommend using a tracking dog that was vaccinated, and you know, to reduce. And they're not supposed to really interact with the badger that they find, so I imagine that risk could be managed if there was one.
Is there any knowledge of them eating burrowing owl young?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. It's just interesting.
Yeah, they will. I mean, it's funny because sometimes I try to promote badgers by saying, hey, they create habitat for burrowing owls and San Joaquin kit fox, but, you know, they eat them too, so.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, they'll definitely eat birds. They'll eat bird eggs, wasp nests they'll sometimes dig up and eat.
I'm with Fish and Wildlife. That comment about dogs caused me to think back of a presentation we had a couple of weeks ago on dogs that track for census purposes. Has that been used for badgers? Because apparently you can sensitize these dogs to specific species odors.
Yeah, and I was saying that's what they're down in San Diego County. The USGS is using those dogs to locate active badger dens and badger scat. And they're just looking at presence and absence within, I think, the MSCP planning area down there. So that could be a very effective way to find badgers, I think. They're not cheap, as it turns out. I had my dog evaluated for his potential effectiveness as a scat detector dog, and he's part cattle dog, so he has the behaviors, but he would have to be trained really intensely and just driven by the search and not be my pet anymore. So I wasn't really willing to give that up. But yeah, I think that could be a lot more effective than a person just walking up and down hills looking for badger dens was. Another thing I think has a lot of potential for monitoring is you know, drones, really, the little ones with cameras, because you can survey a large area and their burrows and their sign is so distinctive. It would be really a much easier way to find active burrows.
Okay, well, it looks like we're out of questions, so thank you so much for coming and spending your time talking to us.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It was great. Thank you, guys. And for anybody who wants to follow up with me, I left a stack of my business cards out by the sign-in sheet, so you can grab one of those on your way out.